because not every day you get to hear from a journalist as smart and thoughtful and groundbreaking as Andrea Joyce. Unless I guess you're Harry, and then just another Wednesday for Harry. But for the rest of us mere mortals, this is such a treat to have Andrea Joyce, a pioneer in sports broadcasting here. I'm a huge Harry Smith fan, but as a fan of sports in the 1980s and the 1990s and throughout, a special treat for me to have Andrea Joyce here today. Andrea grew up in Detroit, Michigan, a fan of the Tigers and the Lions. There were some lean years in there for Lions fans, but things are looking up. A graduate of the University of Michigan, she entered a world of broadcast news where few women were in the newsroom. She secured a job at KKTV in Colorado Springs, Colorado as the, quote, weather girl. Women were largely absent from televised sports at the time, but Andrea Joyce was part of a vanguard of female sports journalists breaking down barriers. She covered her first Olympic Games in 1988, reporting from Seoul, South Korea with a small crew and a small budget for a struggling but ascendant cable station called ESPN. In total, she's covered 17 Olympic Games and is preparing for the 18th upcoming Olympic Games. She's also covered tennis, college basketball, even the Dallas Cowboys, where Coach Tom Landry, won over by Joyce's persistence, opened the door to the locker room and announced to the team, "Men, she's coming in." Andrea is a 2023 inductee into the Sports Broadcasting Hall of Fame. Her fellow Hall of Famer Leslie Visser called her a journalist of, quote, talent and wit and legendary kindness. Please join me in welcoming Andrea Joyce to the stage.
You'll hear more details on that Tom Landry thing in a few minutes. So first of all, I really want to thank all of you for welcoming Harry and me this week. I mean, in 72 hours, we have felt like we've become part of your family. Seriously, we're just gobsmacked by your generosity and your kindness. Not to mention what you're doing at the Murrow College is just, we're just in awe of everything that you're doing. You know, whenever I get asked to do something like this, I'm a little bit hesitant. You know, I have a little voice in the back of my head saying, why me? You know, you heard Harry talking about his imposter complex. Nothing compared to mine. He's talked me off the ledge so many times, we can't count. I'm reminded of an event I participated in at my alma mater, University of Michigan. I was part of the bicentennial celebration. So there's lots of famous alums there, right? So they had been asked to come and speak. We've got astronauts, doctors curing cancer, James Earl Jones. You know, I mean, it's University of Michigan, right? So I'm checking into the hotel and I meet this woman named Judith Gaskin. And she introduces herself and she says, well, you know, I was one of the first members of the Peace Corps. She was on the steps of the Michigan Union when JFK first talked about the idea of the Peace Corps. She was one of the first members. They called her the mother of the Peace Corps. She started VISTA, which was the United States version of the Peace Corps. And so she says, and what about you? Why are you on the agenda? And I said, well, I'm one of the first women in the country to see men naked in a locker room. Thank you very much. Talk about feeling inadequate, right? When I meet people for the first time, the first thing that they want to know is, what was it like 35 years ago when there were so few women doing sports on TV? Did I always dream of this career? Absolutely not. You have to understand, as was mentioned, you know, when I graduated from college in 1976, there were very, very few jobs for women in television at all. In news, there were a couple, absolutely none in sports. I was in grad school, desperate to drop out and get my life started. So I made a little news audition tape. I had a resume, and I started sending those resumes out to TV stations. And I realized that the interest was really about the weather. Like, could you be a weather girl? So I thought, well, if I had a couple of offers from stations in northern Michigan, and I thought, well, if I have to go to a small town, might as well be a good one, right? This is great career planning for all of you. So I get the broadcasting yearbook out. There was something called that at the time. And I looked through all these small towns and everything that ended in springs or beach. So I sent resumes to Palm Beach, Palm Springs, Daytona Beach. Colorado Springs calls me. So I had said in my cover letter that I had a weather audition tape, which I did not. But I didn't want to encourage them. I didn't want to go down that path unless I had to. And they called me and they said, FedEx us your weather audition tape. So I was a teaching assistant in grad school. I called a couple of my friends. We go to the TV studio. We had keys. We open it up at midnight. They get the equipment running. I've got a big giant piece of cardboard in the Detroit News. I open it up to the weather page. I draw the map, and then I make a weather audition tape. They must have been desperate. They hired me. Hired me based on that. They didn't even fly me out. I took the job sight unseen. I was the Monday through Friday main weather person, girl, $4 an hour. I get out there, little did I know, it was borderline poverty, right? Little did I know that the weatherman before me was 6'6". He was 6'6" tall. So they had this giant map for him. This was before green screen. Like, this is Velcro. This is, rain clouds that had Velcro on them. And, just like, seriously, like, this was really it. I came up to Oklahoma. If there was weather up in this part of the world, forget it. There was no way. Like, if I couldn't reach it, I couldn't cover it. So they realized that, okay, so we're going to give you a pointer. So they gave me a pointer. They told me to wear skirts and dresses and smile when I gave away the snowblowers on Thursdays, because that was what the job was, right? It sounds pretty ridiculous. Honestly, saying yes to that job was the absolute best decision I ever made in my life. Saying yes opened up the door to all kinds of possibilities. It also forced me to face unforeseen challenges head on. When I got my chance to transition to news in Wichita, Kansas, I actually had to hide in the ladies' room when they told the anchorman that he would be sharing the desk with a woman. They were afraid that he would storm off and I would have to go on. You all saw the movie Anchorman, right? Comedy? It was a documentary. The other guys on the set made it their job, their mission, to make me laugh or mess up, anything. Like the sports guy, not a lot of sports in Wichita, right? So the sports guy had a taxidermy segment on Wednesdays. So Eric, you went through this local, right? It's crazy. So anyway, so I remember I'm reading voiceover copy when the Pope died. His segment is coming up next. And so I'm not on camera, so all the pictures of the Vatican and the smoke and, and all that stuff. And I'm reading, and he's pecking me on the shoulder with a bird, with a stuffed bird. And he's pecking, and he's pecking. And I'm trying to read, and I'm not looking, and everyone in the studio I can hear them laughing. I can hear people just, they're trying to hold it in. I can't, my voice is quivering. I'm reading the copy like this, and I'm thinking, oh my God, this is it. Newscast ends. I get called into the news director's office, and I know I'm going to hell, because I'm, and then I think probably getting fired before that. So he calls me in and he says, the switchboard, back when there were switchboard, the switchboard lit up while I was, doing the news. And he said the viewers were so touched that I had been so moved by the passing of the Pope. I mean, really? You know, it's funny because we look at these kinds of things today from a completely different lens, right? Was it sexual harassment? Maybe. Back then, though, it was truly all about surviving and moving on. You know, you wanted to keep working, so you kept working. And you just didn't really think about it that much. I'm not undermining anything that anyone goes through, but back then, you just didn't think about it in that way. It was very important, though, when I transitioned into sports a couple of years later, working in Dallas as a news reporter. One night, the sports department was shorthanded, and they asked me to fill in. I knew a lot about sports. The sports department used to come in and grab my Sports Illustrated all the time, but I had never done sports before. I'd done everything else. And they said, we're shorthanded. Can you go out to Reunion Arena, do an interview before the NBA game, and then can you anchor the sports that night? And I'm thinking, I've never done this. I don't think this is a good idea. But again, that whole say yes mantra is like beating, you know, in the front of my mind. So of course I said yes. So the Mavericks were playing the Denver Nuggets. Denver had an eccentric coach that only a few of you in this room will remember, Doug Moe. Doug Moe was completely irreverent. And I asked them, I said, well, do you want me to interview Doug Moe? And they said, don't even try. Don't bother. You'll never get him. He doesn't talk to us. He's, you know, whatever. For some reason, he doesn't talk to us. I thought, well, I'm kind of curious. Like, you know, what if? Like, what if I could get him? So I find out where the team is staying. I call the hotel. The receptionist, surprisingly, puts me through. I woke him up from a nap. That's my biggest regret in my career, is that I never got the name of this woman, because she changed my life, right? I don't make that phone call. I don't get through to him. Maybe I don't ever get this job. So anyway, you know, I call, I get through, I wake him up from a nap, and he agrees to do the interview. I show up. All I had to do was ask one question. I mean, I could have said, what's your horoscope sign? And he just goes off and talks for 3 minutes, and he's hilarious, and it's wonderful. And the news director is sitting back, you know, in the office, and he said, how'd she get Doug Moe, right? So I made that phone call, and that changed the trajectory of my life. And if you're keeping track so far, students, 2 lessons: say yes and be curious, because you don't know what's going to happen. Of course, that was when the drama really started for me, though. Being the first female sportscaster in Dallas, challenging to say the least. I had the full support of the station. They said, we really want to have a news person in the sports department. At the time, there were a lot of former jocks who were, you know, in the locker room, and, you know, team would lose 41-0. And it's like, oh, wow, great effort, you know, and they're patting each other on the back. You know, they had a lot of that back then. And our news director said, we want to have a news person in the department. So I had their full support, and they were terrific to me. The public? Not so much, right? I mean, you're talking Dallas, Texas, not exactly the most progressive place in the world. And there were guys who used to call every night I was on and say, get that you-know-what woman off the air. She has no business doing the sports. One TV critic for a Dallas newspaper admitted that he taped my shows every single night, waiting for me to make a mistake. Trust me, I made many mistakes, but he was not bright enough to catch them. And I will also tell you that I'm certain that there is no male sports reporter who was ever subjected to that kind of scrutiny. It was clear that being a woman in a male-dominated profession would require extraordinary preparation. So lesson 3 was do your homework. Poor Harry. Oh my God, when I think to this day, it is still, he knows when I'm getting ready for an event, he walks in the room and he goes, oh God, you know, and walks out, you know, because I'm spread out everywhere. I have newspapers, you know, back then before the internet, you know, I'm preparing to within an inch of my life, because now I know that this guy is just watching and listening and, you know, listening to every single word I say. So I'm completely borderline neurotic. I devour every single piece of information that I could get. And I'm sent very early on to Cowboy training camp out in Thousand Oaks, California. So there are a lot of beat reporters there who have been covering the Cowboys for years. Now, I know, Eric, you would never, ever, ever do this, but some of those guys who had been doing this for forever would go to the morning practice, get all their sound bites, and then they'd go golf. And then they'd come back and they would do their live shot for their 5 or 6 o'clock sports. You never did that. Anyway. Oh, you're over here. Oh, I thought that was you over there. I can't see. You're right here. Sorry. You could be on TV. Whoever I'm looking at over there. Right? You would have never done that. But anyway. So I never left. I was terrified. I ate breakfast with the team. I went to every single practice. I was there for every meal. I mean, I was like a stalker, right? And the thing is, though, is that people noticed, like some of those coaches, those assistant coaches started to notice, and they started giving me little tips. So when the Cowboys were at home, nobody got in the locker room. They had a special room where they would do the interviews. But on the road, they didn't have that luxury. So all of those post-game interviews took place in the locker room. No woman had ever been in a Dallas Cowboy locker room. After a preseason game in San Diego, my colleagues were all standing outside the locker room, and they're all making bets whether Tom Landry is going to let me in. And I'm thinking, no way. There were a couple of women around the country who were doing sports, and there were stories of them being denied access to the locker room, which you only want to go in because you want to get the story, you want to get your job done and get out, because any of you who've been in a locker room, it stinks. It's like not a great place to be. It's not that much fun. So I'm thinking, there's no way he's letting me in the locker room. So he comes walking down the hall, and he's got that hat on, and he gives me like an imperceptible little nod. And we're all looking at each other. My knees are shaking. And he walks in and he says, "Men, she's coming in." So that Harry always says that should be the name of my book if I ever write a book. And of course, I think I did a horrible job, probably the worst job I ever did that day, because I was so flabbergasted by the whole situation. But anyway, I said yes to the job. I was curious. I did the work, and that's what made the door open. And that foundation, honestly, has served me so well over the years. Without it, I don't think I could have ever survived the challenges still to come, right? Network television, bigger stage, bigger moments that really end up testing your integrity. And since we're in the middle of March Madness, I thought that I would tell you guys a little story from the tournament. Some of you remember Bobby Knight from Indiana, legendary coach. Seemed like every year I would get my schedule for the tournament, and I was assigned to their region, to Indiana's region, right? Honestly, I was afraid of him. I was intimidated. He could be a bully. And I had had a few very, very unpleasant encounters with him. One time, for no apparent reason, we're sitting down doing a one-on-one interview, and he rips the microphone off, every expletive in the world, and storms off. And I'm like, oh boy, and I don't even know what I did. I think I tried to make a joke about him throwing a phone or something at a game, or I don't know. Anyway, 1998. He was involved in some kind of an officiating controversy, and we're scheduled to do a one-on-one interview with him. And the athletic department told me that, this is all good, but you cannot ask him about that officiating controversy. He's said what he's going to say. He's not saying anything else. So my instinct, coming from news, is to not do the interview. They shouldn't be able to dictate what we can and cannot ask, right? Well, it's sports. It wasn't my call. CBS wanted the interview, so I told the sports information director from Indiana that I would not do the interview. I mean, I wouldn't ask the question. I'd do the interview, but I would not ask that question. So I'm standing around waiting for him to show up for this interview, and one of my producers says, why don't you just wait until the end, get everything you need, and then ask him the question? He said, we'll have everything, and then if he gets mad, he said, we'll have like this great stuff. It'll be great TV. I'm looking at him, and I'm horrified, and I said, no, I don't think so. I said, absolutely not. I said, I gave them my word, and I said, you can get somebody else to do the interview because I'm not doing that. And he says, all right. So I don't ask him the question. The next morning, we're getting ready for the first day of the NCAA tournament, which is so much fun for everyone to watch. But when you're working, it's 4 games in one day. You start at 9 o'clock in the morning, you're done maybe 1 o'clock in the morning. And I'm getting set. One game is already done and we have a break. And Bill Raftery comes up to me and he says, Coach Knight wants to see you in the locker room. I'm like, what? Why? Like, I'm so busy, and I think I can't deal with this, and I'm panicked. And after he says, he's such a great guy, he says, it's all right. He said, I'll go with you. So I said, okay, so we go into the locker room, inner sanction of the locker room, and there's Bobby Knight with all of his assistant coaches, all in red. So I have a little PTSD being here, like, still seeing all of this red here at Washington State. And so I'm going to blame it on that I forgot to include a page from my speech, so I have to refer to my phone a little bit. So anyway, so I go in, and I'm thinking, what can this possibly be? And they're all staring at me. And he says, so a little bird told me they overheard a conversation you had yesterday in the hallways. And I'm thinking, oh my God, like people are talking bad. We're not always nice when we're talking about him because he's so mean to us. I'm thinking, what horrible thing did I say? Again, I'm on my way out. It's another like Pope Day. It's like, I've lost my job. And he relays the conversation that I had with the producer about not sandbagging him. And he tells me how much he appreciates that integrity. And he says, if you want a halftime interview, I'll do it. Now, you have to understand that back then, those halftime interviews were not mandatory. It was totally up to the coach. So some of them never did one. Now they're in the middle of a game. Somebody's taking a shot and they're doing interviews. But back then, it was up to them. And Bobby Knight had never ever agreed to a halftime interview. So he says he'll do the interview. So sure enough, halftime rolls around. And my first question was, some stat about the rebounding or whatever. And he puts his arm around me and he says, well, Andrea, you truly do have a great mind for math, don't you? And then he's like flirting with me. And he's answering these questions, and they're back in New York, and they're like, how'd she get Bobby Knight? And the eyebrows are raised, and it was a whole thing. But anyway, it was situations like that. Obviously, you end up relying on that foundation that you built, right? All of those things that I talked about before. The whole time I'm living those dramas at work, I had a real life unfolding at home, and thank God that Harry was there, because I would never, ever have had this career if it hadn't been for Harry, because he picked up when I took off on Thursdays for my assignments. Had get done with the morning show on Friday, and he had 2 little kids, and he was it. He was a single dad all weekend long. Had we ever heard of like actually hiring like a nanny or something? We had babysitters, but we never had a live-in nanny or anything. But my career had taken off like a rocket ship, thanks in large part to Harry and his participation, and again talking me off the ledge so many times. But when CBS lost the NFL, so I had a perfect. I didn't have to work like every single week. I had busy seasons, but it was manageable. When CBS lost the NFL, they had to fill all that time. That's Sunday. That's 7-8 hours of programming, right? So those of us who are on staff had to fill that time. So I'm taking off. I'm doing boxing matches in Las Vegas, and then flying to Denver to do a dog show. And, we're just filling with anything we can. And I realized that I couldn't do it all. I could do a lot, but I couldn't do it all. It's a tricky business, and I think that was one of the toughest things we faced, was how you balance it, how you figure out how to have a real life and work at the same time. So I tried to renegotiate my contract, and I said, I will take a pay cut. I will work event to event. You can pay me per event. I will do I still just want to work, but I can't work this much. And it was a new management, and the executive said, no, he said, we really need people to be all in. And I said, I'm all in. I said, I just can't be all in every single weekend of the year. So my agent goes in and tries to talk to him and, make a plea or whatever, and says the same thing. And he says to my agent, because they had hired some extra people, to sort of pick up some of the slack. But he said, well, we already have one. He said, we just hired Michelle Tafoya. He said, we don't need Andrea. Really? Like, honestly? Like I'm a token? And my agent said, what? And so he said it again. And so my agent calls me up and he said, okay. He said, here's the great news. You don't ever have to work another day in your life. He said, we're going to court, and he said, you will have $20 million, and I said, but I want to work, though. I want to work. So obviously I didn't take his offer to do that, but I left CBS, and lucky for me, Dick Ebersol was over at NBC, and he said, come on over, and he was an executive who never cared if you were a man or a woman, if you were black, white, brown, if you were young, old, gay, straight, did not matter to him. He just wanted storytellers. And that is, it's been the honor of my career to work at NBC and to be able to do all of those Olympics. When I turned 50 at the Olympics in Athens, they decorated the talent room in, if you're doing the math, I turned 50 in Athens. That was 20 years ago. So I'm 70. So anyway, so he thank you. So Dick is out by the trailers sitting in a lawn chair smoking a cigar. And I walked up and made a joke about what seemed to be my inevitable retirement, right? And he looked at me like I was crazy, like, what? I was like, he could not care. So here I am, 20 years later, 17 Olympics under my belt, getting ready for an 18th next year in Milan, and I am proud to say that I am the oldest woman working in sports television. So there. But honestly, I am not special. I grew up borderline middle-class suburban Detroit. My mom was a secretary. My dad sold cars. My dad did 2 tours of duty in the South Pacific, Iwo Jima and Guadalcanal. 4 kids in a 3-bedroom house, 1.5 bathrooms, 3 teenagers at one time trying to share the 1 bathroom that had a shower. So you grow up and you feel like you're just regular. You're just this ordinary teenager. And I got to college, and I think that was when I started to look around, and thank God for professors, right? I mean, you guys are so lucky to have these passionate professors here, because they are there to really, really, really remind you of the importance of things like saying yes and being curious and doing the work. And that's what led me to be this ordinary kid, really, to have this extraordinary life. I can't count the number of interviews that I have done over the last 3.5 decades, but I do know one thing for sure, that even with my lingering imposter complex, I do have a couple of things in common with some of the greatest athletes in the world. They all do the work. They accept the challenges. They say yes. They walk through the door not knowing what's on the other side. I interviewed Venus Williams in 1997 when she made her U.S. Open debut, and she played the very first match on the brand new Arthur Ashe court. She christened that court, a black teenager, right? That moment, the magnitude of that moment is just mind-boggling. I've interviewed her many, many times throughout her spectacular career, but that day was my favorite because I remember looking at her and thinking, I can't even begin to imagine the pressure that she must be feeling and how she handled herself, and the deep breath that she took that day was just something that I will never, ever forget. 5 years ago when Lindsey Vonn retired, she's back now, which is so awesome, but she announced to the world that she was retiring. I was in Sweden for her final races at the World Alpine Championships. We're about this far from the Arctic Circle, and we're doing the interviews. And she's one of the greatest skiers of all time. She has all of these unbelievable accomplishments. And in the final interview, I asked her, I can't remember what the question was, but I remember her answering, yeah, I was nervous. I was really, really scared. I mean, you listen to this and you forget, that they are exactly like the rest of us, You just don't know what's on the other side of that door. Scott Hamilton, the amazing Olympic figure skating champion, 4-time cancer survivor, once told me, I figure I've fallen 41,600 times in my life, and I've gotten up 41,600 times. So Venus, Lindsey, Scott, countless others, it's about that perseverance, putting in the work, embracing the unknown, and doing it with integrity and curiosity, and asking the questions and answering the questions, what if and why not me? So to all of you students out there, I'm not going to be scolding or preaching, but just encouraging. Whatever you decide to do, doesn't matter if it's this business or what business it is, it's a big, fabulous life out there. I mean, there's so much out there. And I urge you to ask those same questions. Let your curiosity guide you. It can help you navigate the road ahead, a road that will no doubt be bumpy. There will be lots of potholes, but that curiosity will guide you through all of that. Curiosity, I also believe, forces you to live in the moment. It forces you to be present in your own life. It'll open your eyes, it'll open your mind, and most importantly, it will open your heart. And ultimately, I truly, truly believe that it will open doors to experiences that you never could have imagined. Thank you so much for having me here today and for welcoming us as you have. Thank you. Thank you. And now we're never leaving. Harry and I are just staying. Oh, yeah, sure.
Hi, Andrea.
Hi.
I want to know, how did you and Harry meet exactly? What was the first time?
So I had been working in Detroit in local news, and I got this great job offer to go to Denver. And I never wanted to leave home again, but I thought, well, it was more money. It was like, main anchor. It was like a big promotion. And so I decided to go out to Denver. And I meet Harry, I think, the first day I was there, and we became friends. And so Harry and the sports guy and I, the three of us would go out to lunch. It's a lot of flirting, but we were friends. We were all really, really good friends. And we had all had those rules of never, ever, ever date anyone that you work with, right? So Harry was wildly impressed with me, and he asked, and so they put me on the noon news at first, and Harry never wanted to be an anchorman, but he wanted to see what it was like to do it. And he said, the only person I want to do this with is Andrea. So he went to the news director and said, can I co-host the noon news with Andrea? So Harry and I are anchoring the noon news together, and every time he says something, I'm, and Harry would say, and I would say something, and Harry would laugh, and of course everyone in the newsroom thinks that we're having some hot, torrid romance going on, which we had not, but we were dear friends, and one thing led to another. He took me to the opera, I took him to a Tiger game, and and here we are almost 40 years later. So you can date your coworker. You just have to be careful, and you have to make sure it's the right person, I think.
Hi, my question is, how did you keep going even after facing so much, discrimination and everything because of your gender and covering sports?
I think that those all of those moments, like I tell those stories because they were part of it. They were part of the journey for sure, but they never ever came close to matching how spectacular everything else was. And for the one person who said something snarky to me, there were 50 who were kind to me and who lifted me up and who were there to support me and help me. So I think it was just this balance of there's just, a creepy person here and there, but at the end of the day, like the good so much outweighed all of that.
So you mentioned that the movie Anchorman is a documentary, not a comedy.
Yeah.
And they would mess with you a lot, but did you ever get them back with things you did to them at all?
No, I was outnumbered. I mean, there was no, listen, this is also like a small station. I think Wichita was, like 56th or something in the country. It was a small, a lot of us were pretty new in the business. I had only done the weather in Colorado Springs for 4 months, so I'm like right out of college, basically. And I'll tell one funny story that's, that people in local news will appreciate. We're all just green as can be, and we're doing the best we can, aside from them trying to make me lose my job. And I'm not even really sure they wanted me to lose my job. I think they just thought it was funny. It wasn't, they didn't think it was mean. But we had one day where we were Kareem Abdul-Jabbar was still playing basketball, and he was, already then he was, 50 years old and still playing. I mean, he was always old, it seemed like, and he was still playing, and everybody was amazed by his career. And we would have those bumpers, that go to the commercial, and the next segment, they thought the next segment was the sports segment, and the font was going to say, "Still to come, he's not getting any older." Well, they mixed it up with the news segment that, again, not a lot of news or sports in Wichita, and it was video of a car accident, and they were pumping a guy's heart, and it says, "Still to come, he's not getting any older." See, like this stuff actually happened. That's not really an answer to your question, but I always love to tell that story. But I always love to tell that story because I don't think anybody got fired, because I think we were all sitting there and we looked at each other and said, "Did they mean to do that? Like, was that done on purpose, or was that a mistake?" So, you get to make mistakes, and you get to survive and live. So.
Hi there. My name's Tony. I teach in the Murrow College. I'm a lifelong Coug, so I want to welcome you and Harry to the Cougar family. But I have to say something. I got a flashback to 1998 in the Rose Bowl. Michigan is playing Washington State University. We have that 1 second. Can you please convince somebody, being an esteemed Michigan grad, to give us that 1 second back and maybe have a chance at a touchdown?
I'm going to, I'm 70 and my memory is really bad. Next question.
Hello, Ms. Joyce. My name is Keith Sconyers. I have a question. You had a phenomenal career. You've broken barriers, impacted many lives around the world. If you could reverse engineer your journey and prepare yourself for the success that you've had, like many of us that are in the room are preparing for that next journey that we're going to go on professionally, how would you prepare yourself for the type of success that you've had?
I'm not sure I would have done anything a little differently, but I think that I wish I had known that I didn't have to be so crazy and so neurotic. I mean, but that did make me prepare the way that I did. And so if I had known that I was going to have this success and to be able to do what I did, I don't think it would have changed that. I mean, that's just sort of in my DNA. And so I'm not sure that there's really anything that I would have changed. Other than just trying to be a little bit more relaxed. And, it wasn't until Harry and I moved to Dallas for his job. He was working for CBS News, and it was the first time in my life I was moving without a job. And I couldn't get work for, well, I thought it was like 5 years, but it was, 2 months? It felt like 1 month. It felt like forever. I'm wallpapering every room in the house, and I'm thinking I'm never going to work again. I'm showing up places in my little suit, in my little anchor suit, and, I say, I'll pull cable, I'll do anything. And it wasn't until that moment that I actually realized that how lucky I was to have the jobs that I had already had. And I think that to me was a turning point in my life, because I never, ever took for granted what I did. And every time I showed up at an Olympics, I always treated it like it was my last one. And that's the young people that I work with. I'm a little annoying because I'm kind of perky, and and I show up and everybody's like, oh, and they're putting like the eye things under their eyes, and they're sometimes they're moaning about the schedule or whatever, and I'm and I think I'm a reminder to them, like, you just don't take it for granted. I mean, we're so lucky and it's so much fun. So I think once I realized that, I don't have regrets, because I've embraced it and loved every minute of it.
Hi, my name is Christine. Thank you so much for being here today. When you were on your career journey, who were your cheerleaders, your mentors, who helped guide you through that process? And did they find you, or did you find them?
We didn't have any. For sports, we didn't have any. And, because there was no one out there. We truly were the pioneers. Leslie Visser was I think, in New York working, and there might have been one other woman, but when I started in sports, there were no, I ended up being the mentor, and we still are. We have a club. We have Girls Night Out, and we have all of these women who work in sports television in front of the camera, behind the camera. We're on a text chain. 6 of us are on a text chain and talk every single day. Mary Carrillo, Leslie Visser, a couple of a woman a dear friend of mine, Suzanne Smith, who's the only woman who directs the NFL, directs NFL games, and we lift up the kids. We have gatherings, we have cocktail parties, and we invite the interns, we invite the kids, and so it's our mission is to lift them up, because we didn't have that, because we were the first ones. I think that before that, and again, even when I was doing news, there weren't that many role models out there. You could look at Barbara Walters, but I'm too busy trying not to laugh, during the newscast, to be able to pay attention to any of that. It's interesting because Michigan did not have a journalism department. And if they had a journalism department, I probably wouldn't be here, because I was going to be a print journalist. That was what I wanted to do. And my role model when I was growing up was a woman who wrote for the Detroit News, and she was in Vietnam. She covered the war. And I remember I would read the paper, and I think I must have been in high school or junior high, and I would read her byline, because it was 1968, I think, and I would read her byline and read these stories, and I thought, this is what I want to do. And I wrote to the paper, and they, I never heard back from them, but I got a letter from her mother, who said, because this is obviously before, the internet and phones and, cell phones, and she wrote to me and she said, Joanne will be so honored that you pay attention and that you're reading. That was somebody who I looked up to, and that was I think that in the back of my head I had her, and I thought, you can do something that somebody hasn't done. You can do something that's extraordinary.
I had a question. Hi, my name is Sada. I'm a student here. I was wondering, how do you think social media has changed the complexity and such of critics and things?
How they changed what?
How social media has changed the complexity of critics and critiquing people on the news?
Well, it's always out there. I mean, I think that back in the day, we had, USA Today had a sports TV critic named Rudy Martzke. And all of our executives, first thing Monday morning, opened up that paper and they read that like that was gospel. And you were terrified. So I kind of came up in the business with that. And to me, nothing could be worse than that, because you would get up Monday morning and think, please don't say anything about me. I don't want you to say anything good about me. I don't want you to say anything bad about me. And I remember one time he gave me a C+ for an event that I wasn't even at. And so, talk about fake news, right? And one time he called me. I was getting ready to host something, and he called me and he said, well, are you watching Hannah Storm on the Goodwill games? This is really something to have a woman, in the anchor chair doing this. And I said, no, quite honestly, I'm not watching, because I'm preparing. I think it was an Olympics coming up. And I said, no, I'm way too busy. I can't, I'm not watching. And he said, okay. So he writes a feature on me, and the first line is, Andrea Joyce sitting in her New York apartment watching Hannah Storm do the Goodwill games. I just told you I'm not watching. So I sort of grew up with that, and it got so bad. Harry had suggested to me, I was getting ready to host the NCAA selection show, the basketball, March Madness selection show, back before we had all of the bells and whistles. And I was in Kansas City, where the NCAA was based then, and I had cards, and we had 120 cards for all of the possibilities of all the different teams. And we had, their records and their mascots and the coach and everything written on these cards. And we had them all laid out, in alphabetical order. And I had an intern with me, and we had to, as soon as they gave us the list of this, they literally handed us paper with the written in names. And we had to put these cards together, and in a commercial break, go on TV and name the 64 teams. I'm terrified. I'm thinking, I cannot do this. Rudy Martzke is going to kill me. I will be crucified. I will make mistakes. This will be horrible. And Harry suggested, he said, you need to talk to somebody. It's like that scene in Moonlighting or whatever, what was it? Moonstruck, when Cher slaps, Nicolas Cage and says, snap out of it. It's like, I was terrified, and I was so I was so nervous it was getting in the way of me being able to do that job. So Harry said, you got to talk to somebody. So we found this sports psychologist, and I talked to, and he was tremendously helpful. And I just basically, you know, I took a deep breath and I ended up doing it. So I had that experience then. So now, I mean, I don't know, I worry about the athletes, you know, more than I worry about people in television who are called, you know, because you sort of get, you hope that you don't pay too much attention to it, and you hope it doesn't affect your job. I do remember, I'll tell one little story. I do remember though doing a gymnastics event, and I'm everybody's friend. I'll ask tough questions. I do. When a tough question needs to be asked, I'll ask it. But we were doing a gymnastics event, and this one young gymnast, her coach, who was a former Olympian, Kim Zemeskel, had given her this necklace thing, and every time she hit her vault or whatever in practice, you know, she got a bead, and so she got to make this, you know, so the necklace is getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and she's getting ready for the Olympics. And so I do this story because it's got a prop, it's cute, you know, we think this young woman is going to make the team, and I say, and so she's got this necklace, and you know, by the time the Olympic trials come, it's going to be so long, you know, I do this really, I think, really fun story. So we get off the air. And, you know, and so the guys that I'm working with are all like, oh my God, you know, and they're looking at their phones and they're reading all the critique. And people would critique Tim Daggett, you know, they would just, you know, just mercilessly, you know, they wanted somebody else to do that, you know, and he was so good at what he did and he was so passionate about it. He would read everything that everybody wrote online, and Al Trotwig, our dear friend who just passed away, you know, they would read everything, and I never turned it on. I never looked, because I thought, no, why would anybody talk about me? And I said, you guys are crazy. You shouldn't be looking. And I said, well, it's fine for me. I said, nobody talks about me. And they said, oh yeah, they do, you know. And so they show me that these people, they've started this thread like, she's treating these gymnasts like they're little girls, and how could she? And I'm like, what? Like I couldn't. So that was my lesson, to never look. But you know, I do think I think it's worse for the athletes for sure. But I feel sorry for the people who do look at it. You know, Harry erased his social media because, you know, there's like one person in the world who doesn't like Harry. You know, and they contact too.
Hi, Andrea. I'm Wendy. I just wanted to tell you what an honor it is to have you here speaking to our students. And I appreciated what you said to a smaller group on Friday about writing. And I was hoping, since you have such a big audience here today, you could talk about that a little bit more with them.
Well, so that's one of the things that Harry, and I truly believe that Harry Smith is the best writer I know. And so I'm surrounded by that greatness all the time. And I truly believe that if you know how to write, you can do anything. You can go into any profession in the world, and it'll take you great places, because you're relaying, you're communicating. You've actually looked at something, you've actually paid attention, and now it's your job to translate that and make people feel like they were where you were, you know, that they experienced that as well. So I think that for me, writing is always, they say, well, you don't really have to write. You only ask 2 questions after a competition, you know, so you don't need to. I write nonstop. I craft those questions. I take it very seriously. I think about it. I take, you know, notes like crazy and keep track of all of these quotes that people's things they say to me, and being able to weave that into stories and being able to tell a story. The only way that you can do that is if you're a good writer. And I think that writing is really important, no matter what you decide to do.
Hey, Andrea. I wanted to ask how your process has changed to prepare for big events like the Olympics. Has it changed at all with social media and obviously all these stats being available online?
Yeah, the only thing different is that the information is more available. And you know, I show up for the World Championships, you know, figure skating World Championships last week in Boston, and I have a binder, and I have a bio on every single athlete. So that's changed, but I also know that everyone is human and people make mistakes, and you want to verify. You always want to verify. You know, Harry is notorious for years. You know, he would get note cards when he was doing the morning show, and he would you trust people, you have to trust people you work with, but at the same time, you have to verify, and you have to make sure that if it's coming out of your mouth, you know what you're saying. So I think that it hasn't changed a lot. It's become maybe a little bit easier to gather the information, but I spend just as much time getting ready as I did before. And you'd laugh to see in this day and age, in 2025, I have files. I have files on every sport, on every athlete. I mean, my file on Ilya Malinin, the kid who won his second world championship at figure skating, he's only 20 years old. His file's this thick. You know, I don't put it in my computer. I have the notes. And so I remember and I know what he said to me at his very first competition, you know, and I can draw from that. So I haven't changed a lot of how I prepare, but the preparation is made a little bit easier with the internet and obviously with a staff of researchers. Okay. Somebody over here. You could just yell. Oh.
Hi, Andrea. You said that you had plenty of moments where you had like imposter syndrome, and Harry talked you through it. Was there anything he said to you that was particularly inspiring?
I think I would just like, it was like vomit of the mouth. Like I would just like be like this, and Harry would say, and I'm not even sure I ever really heard what he said, but no, but I think what Harry always reminded me is that, you know, you belong there. You know, you belong there. And it's interesting, you know, hearkening back again to last week, we had this amazing figure skater, Amber Glenn, who had serious mental health issues for a good portion of her life, and never feeling like she belonged, and is now in a place where she actually, you know, it's the old Sally Fields thing from the Academy Awards when she said, "You like me, you really like me." You start to, I think that you hear it enough, and you begin to realize that you are good enough, that you do belong. I can't remember anything in particular. You remember? I think you just said, "Snap out of it." You know, I think it's like.
I'm a professor. I really don't need the microphone. Hi, my name's Kara, and I love women's sports. I'm the women's sports girly in this college, probably. And I have a podcast where we interview the pioneers of women's distance running, and they talk about sports coverage of themselves at the time because they were fighting to run equal distance. You're a pioneer in your space as a woman. How did you deal with maybe some of the ways that women were framed as an athlete as a woman yourself when covering them? So like, how did you deal with maybe seeing how women athletes were framed or like talked about a little misogynistically as a woman sports reporter in the space?
Well, that's a really good question. I think that, you know, for back in my days at CBS, we covered the NCAA Final Four, for the women's Final Four. The men's Final Four would have a cast of thousands. They'd have writers and, you know, producers and literally like hundreds of people working on those shows. We had a little band of 6 of us who did just as much programming, but so we knew how we had to work. But watching, you know, being at those events, because we didn't do a lot of women's sports back then. You know, there's not enough on TV now as it is, but there's more, thank goodness. But back then, that was it. I mean, you would show every now and then they'd show a women's basketball game during the regular season, but there wasn't much else other than tennis. You know, you'd be at a professional tennis event. But watching the women's Final Four and being at those practices and watching how they trained and how they, I think that, yes, there's definitely a similarity. And, you know, obviously they were all much younger than I was, but I remember thinking that this is what it takes to be great, right? I mean, you all take that same path and you all do the same kind of work. And it's, you know, and at the end of the day, no matter what happens, it's a victory. And, you know, I learned a lot from Pat Summit. I worked with her closely for a couple of years, and, you know, she was just a force. And, you know, and because you're sitting there and you're thinking, well, I'm on TV, and, you know, like this is pretty great. And you look at what this woman had done and what she had accomplished at a time when it would, you know, and it's still not, you know, listen, Caitlin Clark has moved mountains, you know, for the sport. But that was always there. It was always there. That greatness was always there. So, you know, so I think that also what I learned through the years, and this is, you know, I think that women in sports learn it too, is that, you're patient, but then at some point you just, you beat that door down and you say, pay attention to us. Right? Okay.
Hi, I'm also a professor at Murrow.
You have to really talk up because I can barely hear
sorry.
you.
I said I'm also a professor at Murrow, like Cara. I recently came from the industry side, PR and advertising. I started as a writer. I have a similar joke to you about your anchorman, but mine is Mad Men. I always insert Mad Men there. My question's back to the writing comment you made, and something that, since I recently transitioned from industry to teaching, that's come up a lot is AI. Do you have thoughts on AI? Have you had to dabble with it? Have you had to consider it much? Or do you feel like you kind of escaped that so far?
Remind me what it is? No. That's about my extent of, I mean, there are times when I think, oh, gee, I'm 70, and then there are times I think, oh, yay, I'm 70, because that is not part of my world. And I think when I was getting ready for Paris for the last Olympics, somebody said, well, you should use AI. This is great for your research. And I'm thinking, I don't know. And I did. I went on a site and I thought, okay, I looked, but everything that I had already researched was all there, but it was all there on one page. And so what I ended up doing is that I sort of looked at that as, so is that affirmation of what I have, but again, I still feel like I have to verify it because it's everything I've read and I don't know firsthand, and I know that I have to ask people in person when I get the opportunity before I say any of these things out loud. So I'm probably not equipped to answer much about AI other than the fact that, I'm glad I'm as old as I am and I don't have to understand all of it.
Hi, Andrea. I'm Ella. I'm a student here. As someone who's interested in the sports journalism, I have the knowledge and I am working on the skills, but I'm still terrified to step into the field. What is your biggest mindset or motto in times of self-doubt or nerves?
I think at the end of the day, if you walk in prepared, you belong there. There's no reason why you can't, just like you stood up just now and asked a question, you get to do that. You have the right to do that. And honestly, I'm going to tell you, I have been in press conferences. It's particularly bad in tennis, where you have, and I'm not dissing reporters from international media, but somebody will come in from some scandal magazine or whatever, and they'll ask Roger Federer, when was the last time you beat your wife? I mean, they ask really stupid questions just to get a rise out of them, and you see the athlete's response. But the fact is that if you're a serious person, and if you approach this seriously, and if you approach this with integrity, you belong there, and you will, and you ask those questions, and you will always get a real answer. One of the things that I have learned over the years is that if I've done my homework, and if I know everything about that athlete, and when they know that I've taken the effort to do that, what I get back is so much more than what I put out. So I think that once and it's scary to say, okay, now I'm actually going to go out there and do this. But if you're prepared, that should give you so much confidence that you just have a conversation. You're just talking to somebody, and it ends up being, it was what Harry said yesterday, it ends up being, it's about them. It's at the end of the day, it's not about you. And the less you think about yourself and about what do I want to find out from this person and how can I get them to talk to me, it's really about getting them to tell you their story. And I think that the less self-conscious you feel about it, and the more you think, this is my mission, this is my job. It's not about me. It's not about if I fumble on my words or whatever. That doesn't matter. You've done your homework, you belong there, and just, go out there and do it, right? Thank you. Thank you.